He raised his glass to our 16 guests and introduced me as the family maid, treating the insult like a harmless holiday joke. Polite laughter echoed through the dining room. It abruptly died when the most powerful man at the table set down his fork and addressed me by my actual, hard-earned title. My father thought he was cementing my place at the bottom. He had no idea he had just triggered his own absolute ruin. My name is Brooklyn Young, and the air inside the dining room of my childhood home tastes like roasted sage, expensive French butter, and suffocating cruelty. We are sitting inside the Young family estate in Darien, Connecticut. The room is a monument to carefully curated wealth. Heavy velvet drapes frame the floor-to-ceiling windows, shutting out the biting November wind. A fire roars in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing orange shadows across the gleaming mahogany table. Sitting around this table are 16 guests. They are not friends. They are a carefully assembled audience. My father, Grant Young, does not host Thanksgiving dinners to celebrate family. He hosts them to showcase his leverage. The 16 people seated around us are a strategic mix of private equity investors, corporate defense attorneys, powerful members of the local hospital board, and a handful of exceptionally wealthy neighbors. They are the people Grant needs to impress to keep his financial empire afloat. Grant stands at the head of the table. He holds a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The light catches the gold liquid, throwing bright, fractured reflections across his tailored suit. He taps a silver spoon against the glass. The sharp, clear chime cuts through the low hum of conversation. The clinking of heavy silverware against bone china comes to an immediate halt. 16 pairs of eyes turn toward the patriarch. Grant smiles. It is a practiced, blinding expression, entirely devoid of genuine warmth. He begins the ritual. It is a parade of status, wrapped up in the guise of a holiday toast. He moves down the line, introducing his guests one by one, highlighting their recent corporate acquisitions, their charitable donations, their country club affiliations. He is mapping out the hierarchy of the room, ensuring everyone knows exactly how much power is concentrated at this single table. Then, his gaze shifts away from the guests and settles on his own blood. He turns to my older sister. Sloane sits to his immediate right, glowing in a silk designer dress that costs more than a decent used car. And of course, my eldest daughter, Sloane, Grant announces, his voice swelling with theatrical pride. He gestures toward her as if presenting a rare, priceless artifact, the radiant face of our family, our pride and joy. Sloane offers a flawless, practiced smile to the table. Several guests murmur their agreement, raising their glasses in her direction. She is exactly what Grant wants in a daughter. She is a pristine surface, a shiny hood ornament for the family brand. Grant lets the admiration linger in the air for a few seconds. Then, his eyes slide down the table and land on me. The indulgent warmth instantly vanishes from his features. His jaw tightens. A sharp, rehearsed smirk pulls at the corner of his mouth. And then we have Brooklyn, my father says. His voice drops a register. He adopts a tone of mocking, exaggerated affection. Sloane is the beauty, but Brooklyn here keeps the house clean. She is our maid. The word hangs in the air. Maid. For one agonizing second, there is absolute, deafening silence. The cinematic machinery of the room seems to grind to a brutal halt. I can hear the crackle of a burning log in the fireplace. I can hear the shallow, rapid intake of breath from the woman sitting to my left. Then, the nervous reactions begin. A few people let out short, awkward bursts of social laughter, desperate to pass the cruelty off as an eccentric family joke. Others, the ones who recognize the raw venom in the statement, suddenly find the patterns on their china plates utterly fascinating. They look down, refusing to make eye contact, cowardly shifting in their expensive chairs. I feel a small, warm hand tug frantically at my sleeve. I look down. My daughter, Lila. She is exactly 9 years old today. She is wearing a velvet dress I bought for her, her dark hair brushed perfectly. Her large eyes are wide, reflecting the flickering candlelight. She looks up at me, her brow furrowed in genuine, innocent confusion. "Mommy," Lila whispers, her small voice cutting straight through the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Is being a maid a bad thing? The question is a physical blow. It strikes the center of my chest, threatening to crack me wide open. A lesser woman would have shattered right then. A lesser woman would have burst into tears, pushed back her chair, and run from the room, giving Grant exactly the dramatic victory he craved. I do not cry. I do not flinch. I do not even blink. I reach out and place my hand over Lila's, giving her fingers a firm, reassuring squeeze. Then, I pick up my wineglass. I do not drink. I simply hold it by the stem, staring down into the deep, blood-red pool of the Pinot Noir. I watch the tiny reflections of the chandelier suspended in the liquid. In this exact moment, I feel a heavy steel door slam shut inside my mind. The wounded daughter, the woman who spent years hoping for a scrap of validation from the man standing at the head of the table, dies instantly. She is replaced by someone else entirely. I lock away the pain. I transition into pure, cold calculation, slowly, deliberately. I raise my eyes from the glass. I do not look at my father. I look past him. I look all the way down the long stretch of polished mahogany to the opposite end of the table, sitting at the far end, commanding the space without saying a single word, is Malcolm Reed. He is the founder and chairman of Reed and Vale Residential, a massive real estate conglomerate. He is the undisputed king of this dinner party, the ultimate prize my father has spent thousands of dollars tonight trying to court. Grant believes he is paving the way for a massive commercial deal waiting to be signed the morning after the holiday. Malcolm is not laughing. He is not staring at his plate. He has stopped eating entirely. His heavy silver fork rests perfectly still against the rim of his dish. His sharp, calculating eyes are locked directly on me. Across the length of the silent, tense room, our eyes meet. A distinct flicker of recognition passes over Malcolm's rugged face. He leans back slightly in his chair. He knows. He knows exactly who I am. And he knows I am not the broken domestic servant my father just described. Grant stands tall at the head of the table, entirely oblivious to the silent communication happening right in front of him. He takes a sip of his champagne, looking incredibly smug. He thinks he has just successfully put me in my place. He thinks he has asserted his dominance in front of Connecticut's elite. He has absolutely no idea that he has just armed the bomb that will level his entire life. I place my heavy linen napkin on the table. The fabric folds perfectly next to my plate. The movement is smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of panic. I turn my head and look at my father. My expression is a mask of carved ice. "Excuse me," I say, my voice steady and completely flat. "I need to take Lila out to the hall to get her coat." I stand up. I do not wait for a response. I take my 9-year-old daughter by the hand and turn my back on the 16 people staring at me. As I walk out of the heavy wooden doors of the dining room, leaving the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine behind, I make a silent, unbreakable vow in the quiet of the hallway. This year will be the absolute last time I ever sit in silence at the young family table. 7 years ago, the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate felt less like an entrance and more like the jaws of a trap. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a rusted sedan that barely made it up the steep incline of the driveway. In the back seat, Lila was exactly 2 years old, sleeping peacefully against a faded car seat, completely unaware that our lives had just been violently fractured. The divorce had not been a mutual, polite uncoupling. It was an absolute financial slaughter. My ex-husband had buried us in hidden debt, leaving me to face the creditors. I returned to my childhood home with exactly 2 suitcases, a sleeping toddler, and a bank account that hovered dangerously close to absolute zero. My previous career trajectory in corporate project management had been thoroughly derailed by the chaotic, exhausting fallout of the legal proceedings. I was raw, bone-tired, and desperately hoping for a motherly embrace or a fatherly hand on my shoulder to tell me we would be safe. Neither of those things came. When Grant opened the Grand Oak front door, he did not reach out to hold his granddaughter or comfort his bleeding daughter. He stood in the sweeping entryway, dressed in a flawless tailored suit, looking at me as if I were a negligent contractor arriving late for a minor irritating renovation. There were no tears of reunion. There was only a swift, cold, calculated negotiation. He led me past the warmth of the family living room and directly into his oak-paneled study, laying out the precise terms of my sanctuary. I was permitted to occupy the carriage cottage out back. It was a drafty, poorly insulated converted garage sitting roughly 200 feet from the main house, entirely hidden from the street by a thick row of manicured private hedges. Grant made his position entirely clear before I even unpacked a single shirt for my child. He looked me dead in the eye and stated, in a voice completely void of empathy, that this arrangement was strictly conditional and absolutely not permanent. I was a tenant living on his reluctant grace, and that grace had a tight, unspoken expiration date. The sheer disparity in how the young family allocated its resources and affection was a masterclass in psychological conditioning. While I was patching drafty windows in the cottage with cheap plastic wrap to keep the winter wind off my daughter, my older sister was being actively canonized. Sloane was the ultimate family project, the golden asset. Our parents happily funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into her Ivy League education, her exclusive country club memberships, and her rotating designer wardrobe when she needed a foothold in local high society. Grant simply bought her a high-profile seat on the hospital charity board. She was the pristine face of the family brand, the flawless return on their social and financial investments. My path had always been fundamentally different, and in Grant's eyes, different meant defective. I had always possessed a sharp, analytical, fiercely independent mind. I graduated in the top 10% of my college class, working insanely long hours to master complex logistical systems. But I lacked the desire to play the corporate law or high finance games my father deemed acceptable. I preferred building things, organizing chaos, fixing broken machinery, to Grant and my mother. This practical streak was a deeply embarrassing genetic flaw. They frequently, casually reminded me that I lacked the proper aesthetic. I was not refined enough. I did not fit the glossy, country club young profile. I was too direct, too eager to roll up my sleeves, too willing to look at the ugly, rusted gears underneath the shiny veneer of their high society. Driven by the pure, terrifying necessity to feed my daughter and keep the heat on, I took whatever work I could legally find. I started at the very bottom of the local service economy. I took grueling jobs scrubbing grout in massive mansions, organizing chaotic supply closets for overwhelmed wealthy housewives, and answering frantic phone calls at 3 a.m. when a burst pipe threatened to ruin a $3 million art collection. It was exhausting, invisible, bone-deep labor. I wore generic khaki pants and navy polo shirts, blending into the background of grand estates much like the one I grew up in, treated as part of the furniture. But while I was down on my hands and knees scrubbing baseboards, I was watching. I was absorbing everything. I quickly realized a massive, lucrative fundamental truth about the ultra-wealthy class. They possess enormous capital, but they severely lack operational control over their own lives. They do not just need a person to push a mop. They desperately need a discreet, hyper-competent ghost to manage the sprawling, complex risk of their private empires. They need someone who knows exactly which specialized contractor to call when the commercial-grade heating fails during a blizzard. Someone who can quietly handle aggressive insurance adjusters. Someone who can fix a massive household catastrophe before it ever reaches the ears of the dinner guests. To my parents looking down from the glowing windows of the main house, I was merely the neighborhood cleaning lady. I was a humiliating, temporary failure camped out in their backyard like a squatter. but to my rapidly growing list of high net worth clients across the county. I was becoming an absolute, undeniable necessity. I was the rare, fiercely protective professional who could walk into absolute chaos, restore perfect order, and never breathe a single word of their private disasters to the local gossips. People looking from the outside might ask why I stayed in that freezing carriage cottage for 7 long years. Why not pack up Lila and move to a small, quiet apartment in a different town the moment I secured my first 5 steady, high-paying clients? The answer is not rooted in financial dependence. It is rooted in social terror. Grant Young is a man who completely controls the narrative of our town. If I had left prematurely, if I had publicly severed the tie before I was completely, financially bulletproof, he would have instantly weaponized my departure. He would have painted me as the unstable, ungrateful daughter stealing his precious grandchild away in the night. He would have used his lawyers to legally and socially cut Lila off from her only extended family, turning the entire community against me. I stayed because I needed Lila to have some connection to her heritage, even if that connection was deeply, fundamentally flawed. More importantly, I stayed because I finally stripped away my childhood illusions and understood the true mechanism of my family. The Young family operates exactly like a ruthless luxury corporation. Sloan is the glittering storefront, the polished marketing campaign designed to attract investors, loans, and admiration. But every glossy brand needs a dark contrast to prove its ultimate worth. I was the designated shadow. Grant kept me close, trapped in that little cottage, to serve as his perpetual cautionary tale. I was the living, breathing evidence of what happens when you disobey the patriarch. My perceived poverty and failure was the dark, necessary backdrop that made Sloan's manufactured success shine so blindingly bright. But over the past 48 months, the absolute reality of my situation has drastically, secretly shifted away from their carefully constructed fiction. By the time this Thanksgiving arrived, I was absolutely no longer the desperate, penniless woman who pulled into their driveway. My corporate bank accounts are heavy. My private business is thriving brilliantly in the shadows. I do not wear tailored suits, and I still drive a practical, unassuming car, but I hold far more actual, liquid leverage than Grant could possibly imagine. I simply never felt the pathetic desire to beg for his validation anymore. I did not need him, or anyone in that grand house, to formally acknowledge that I had rebuilt my life. I only needed to know it myself. My transformation did not happen overnight. It was forged slowly, built in the quiet, unseen corners of other people's massive homes. It started with a cheap, wire-bound notebook kept in the glove compartment of my rusted sedan, while I scrubbed imported marble countertops and vacuumed custom wool rugs. I began keeping a meticulous, heavily detailed ledger of systemic negligence. I noted which sprawling coastal properties had ancient, corroded plumbing valves just waiting to rupture under pressure. I documented the specific estates where expensive security protocols vanished into thin air the exact moment the owners flew to Europe for the summer. I tracked exactly how many weeks slipped by before anyone noticed a slow, creeping roof leak in a vacant guest wing. The ultra-wealthy possessed infinite financial resources, but they were shockingly vulnerable to basic, relentless entropy. They were hemorrhaging tens of thousands of dollars simply because no one was looking at the entire operational board. The luxury service market was completely saturated with high-end concierges who could book a private jet at midnight or source rare white truffles for a dinner party. But absolutely no one was handling the hard, dirty, unglamorous mechanics of maintaining a $10 million physical asset. I realized these homeowners did not just need someone to wipe away dust. They desperately needed an ironclad shield. They required private estate operational management. That meant hiring specialized staff, controlling aggressive contractors, maintaining brutal insurance compliance, and establishing genuine emergency response protocols. I took my battered notebooks and my meticulously compiled data to the only person in my entire bloodline who understood the deep value of quiet, unglamorous hard work. My aunt, Ruth Delaney owned a dusty, highly profitable antique shop on the industrial edge of town. She was the family outcast, a pragmatic woman who preferred the sharp smell of old wood polish to toxic country club gossip. We sat in her cramped, poorly lit back office, drinking bitter black coffee out of paper cups, while I laid out my business plan. I did not ask for a charitable handout. I asked for a seed investment based purely on projected returns. Ruth looked at my spreadsheets, instantly recognized the ruthless efficiency of my model, and wrote me a cashier's check for $75,000. With that critical capital, I leased a windowless, 400-square-foot office in a concrete industrial park completely outside my father's elite social orbit. I registered the corporation under the name Northbridge Estate Continuity Group. From day one, I refused to hire people with polished hospitality degrees or glossy resumes. I recruited former military logisticians, retired municipal building inspectors, and seasoned general contractors who knew how to spot catastrophic structural failures months before they actually happened. We built a proprietary, encrypted software system to track rigorous maintenance schedules, vendor contracts, and security perimeters for every single property under our care. The defining crucible for Northbridge arrived during the third week of September. 3 years into our operation, a freak, late-season storm slammed directly into the Connecticut coastline, bringing massive surges that breached seawalls and flooded basement levels across the wealthiest zip codes in the state. While other boutique management companies panicked and sent their frantic clients straight to voicemail, Northbridge deployed immediately. We had staging areas fully prepped 72 hours before landfall. My teams were on the ground with heavy industrial water extractors and commercial emergency generators, while the freezing rain was still coming down sideways. Over the course of 48 brutal, completely sleepless hours, we saved approximately $4 million in fine art, custom hardwood flooring, and irreplaceable assets for our clients. After that storm, word of mouth spread through the private country clubs and exclusive yacht marinas like wildfire. Northbridge was no longer a scrappy startup. We became the absolute gold standard for discreet, aggressive asset protection in the region. We began signing exclusive 3 to 5 year retainer contracts, each worth deep into the six figures. Yet, despite holding the operational keys to some of the most expensive real estate on the eastern seaboard, I intentionally maintained absolute, unbroken anonymity. When I visited a site to conduct a quarterly audit or manage an active crisis, I did not wear a tailored silk blazer or carry a designer leather briefcase. I wore heavy-duty work boots, durable canvas trousers, and a nondescript, weather-beaten utility jacket. When new clients or their wealthy, nosy neighbors saw me walking the perimeter of a property with a heavy clipboard, they automatically assumed I was a mid-level supervisor for a landscaping crew or a specialized repair technician. I never once bothered to correct them. The invisibility was my greatest operational asset. It allowed me to observe the unvarnished truth of a property without the owners putting on a fake, polite performance. It also guaranteed my family would remain entirely ignorant of my rapid corporate ascent. I knew with absolute certainty that if Grant discovered I was running a multi-million-dollar firm, he would completely ignore the impressive balance sheet and focus entirely on the dirt smudged on my boots. He would only ever see a glorified janitor. This strategy of aggressive, blue-collar competence is exactly how I secured my most vital and lucrative client. Reed and Vale Residential managed a massive, complex portfolio of elite, short-term luxury rentals, and high-yield private estates. They required a master vendor who could guarantee absolute operational silence and zero liability. I bypassed their procurement board and pitched their executive team directly. I won the massive account purely on the terrifying accuracy of my predictive risk assessment models. For 2 solid years, I worked closely with their corporate infrastructure. Eventually, those high-stakes interactions escalated to direct, confidential briefings with the founder himself. Malcolm Reed is a man who values flawless execution far above social pedigree. In our highly encrypted email threads and our brief, heavily technical phone calls, I was simply the founder and managing principal of Northbridge. I was the reliable vendor who saved a critical, multi-million-dollar real estate closing by resolving a catastrophic black mold issue 24 hours before the final buyer inspection. He respected my absolute refusal to engage in social small talk and my intense obsession with hard data. Crucially, because all our lucrative contracts were signed under my corporate entity, and because we never moved in the same elite social circles. Malcolm had absolutely no idea that the brilliant operational director he relied on was actually Grant Young's deeply disappointing daughter. By the time this Thanksgiving rolled around, my company was evaluating a massive expansion into the Hamptons market, forecasting a 35% revenue increase for the upcoming fiscal year. I was a self-made powerhouse commanding a small, highly trained army of experts. Yet, the moment I drove my practical car back through the grand wrought iron gates of my father's estate, none of that reality mattered. In the boardroom, I dictated aggressive terms to billionaires and reshaped their operational budgets. In the carriage cottage behind the hedges, I was still just the disgraced dependent. Every Sunday dinner, Grant would look right through me, deliberately using words perfectly designed to shrink me down to the size of a failure. Completely blind to the empire I had quietly built right under his polished shoes. Exactly 7 days before the dining room table became a battleground, the trap began to snap shut. It started with a brief, entirely casual text message from Grant, summoning me to his private study. I walked into the house through the heavy kitchen doors, smelling the early preparations for the massive holiday menu, and made my way down the long, carpeted hallway. His study was a dark, imposing room that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and old paper. Grant was sitting behind his massive oak desk. He did not look up immediately. He was busy signing a stack of letters, projecting the image of a titan of industry burdened by endless responsibilities. Finally, he pushed a thick, heavy, stapled packet of paper across the polished wood toward me. He offered a tight, dismissive smile. He told me it was simply a temporary relocation confirmation regarding the carriage cottage. He claimed the estate was undergoing a minor zoning adjustment to lower his property taxes, and the township required a signature from the current occupant to verify that the structure could be vacated for a period of 30 days during the hypothetical renovations. He handed me a silver pen, tapped the bottom line of the last page, and told me to sign it quickly so he could overnight the package to his attorneys before the holiday weekend. He expected me to act like the broken, compliant daughter he had meticulously cultivated. He expected me to blindly trust the patriarch, but Grant completely forgot, or perhaps never realized, that I spent 80 hours a week dissecting complex legal liabilities for massive estates. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I picked up the 30-page document and began to read the fine print. It took my trained eyes exactly 2 minutes to slice through the dense legal jargon and find the poison hidden inside the paragraphs. This was absolutely not a temporary relocation form. It was an ironclad, irrevocable waiver of residency rights. By signing it, I would legally declare that I held no tenant rights, no claim to the property, and no legal standing to contest an eviction. Furthermore, the document included a sworn affidavit stating that the carriage cottage was currently entirely vacant and had not been used as a primary residence for the past 36 months. I flipped to the third exhibit, searching for the counterparty to this agreement. I needed to see exactly who required my home to be classified as an unencumbered, vacant commercial asset. When I read the name of the purchasing entity, the blood turned to ice in my veins. The entity was listed as Harbor Horizon Holdings Limited. I knew that specific limited liability company intimately. 6 months prior, my firm had run a massive operational risk audit on a portfolio of coastal properties owned by that exact holding company. Harbor Horizon was a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Reed and Vale Residential, Malcolm Reed's company. The sheer scale of the deception hit me like a physical blow. Grant was not merely restructuring his local taxes. He was leveraging the entire estate, including the cottage where my daughter slept, to secure a massive capital loan or perhaps a joint development venture. And to close the deal, he was actively manufacturing a fraudulent narrative, presenting the property as clear of all residential liabilities. My father was attempting to defraud one of the most powerful real estate conglomerates on the East Coast. He was lying directly to the man who happened to be my most lucrative and trusting private client. I kept my face perfectly still. I closed the file, picked it up, and told Grant I needed to read it over carefully before putting my name on anything. His mask of paternal patience instantly cracked. He slammed his hand flat against the desk. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. He told me this was basic family business, that I was overstepping my boundaries, and that he absolutely required my signature before the Tuesday morning financial closing date. I did not argue. I simply turned around and walked out of the study with the papers gripped tightly in my hand. That evening, precisely at 8 o'clock, the secondary phase of the manipulation began. My mother, Elaine, sent a polite message asking me to join her in the sunroom for tea. It was a classic, highly orchestrated good cop routine. She poured Earl Grey into delicate china cups, her face arranged in a mask of gentle, motherly concern. She sighed dramatically, stirring honey into her cup, and began talking about how much pressure Grant was under. She framed the document as a tiny, insignificant favor to help the family weather a brief financial storm. She reached out, placing her soft, perfectly manicured hand over my rough one, and practically begged me to just sign the paper to keep the peace in the household. I looked at my mother, searching her eyes for any trace of genuine protection. There was none. I quietly pulled my hand away and told her I could not sign a document that legally perjured me and stripped my daughter of her registered home address. The moment the refusal left my lips, Elaine's gentle facade evaporated. Her posture went completely rigid, the warmth drained from her face, leaving behind a cold, sneering contempt. She set her teacup down so hard the china rattled dangerously. She looked at me as if I were a stain on her expensive rug. She asked me who I thought I was, daring to question the man who had kept a roof over my head for 7 long years. Then, she pulled out the most jagged weapon in her arsenal. She explicitly compared me to Sloane. She said Sloane understood loyalty. She said Sloane recognized the sacrifices made for the family name. And then, with a voice dripping with absolute venom, my mother leaned in and delivered the final blow. She told me that if I were actually as smart or as successful as I pretended to be, I would not still be squatting in a drafty garage in her backyard. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my tea. I stood up, thanked her for the drink, and walked back out into the freezing November night. Her brutal honesty was the catalyst I needed. It cleared away any lingering hesitation. As I walked across the dark lawn toward the cottage, a terrifying new suspicion took root in my mind. If Grant was willing to aggressively falsify my living situation to secure this new influx of capital, what else had he been doing? I had lived on this property for 7 years. I began to wonder exactly how my father had been utilizing my silent, marginalized existence on his tax returns and insurance declarations for the better part of a decade. The very next morning, I drove into the city center and walked into the offices of Darius Bell. Darius was my private corporate attorney, a man who built his firm on ruthless pragmatism rather than country club networking. His office did not feature mahogany paneling or oil paintings. It featured steel filing cabinets and stacks of heavily redacted financial disclosures. He was entirely unimpressed by the young family reputation, which was exactly why I paid his exorbitant hourly rate. I dropped the 30-page relocation addendum directly onto his desk. I sat across from him and laid out the entire situation, from the fake zoning excuse to the involvement of the Reed and Vale subsidiary. Darius did not interrupt. He put on his reading glasses and methodically dissected the document, his pen slashing through the predatory clauses. When he reached the final indemnity waiver, he stopped. He read the paragraph twice. He took off his glasses, set his pen down, and looked directly across the desk at me. His expression was not sympathetic. It was the sharp, predatory look of a lawyer who had just smelled blood in the water. Darius leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He told me that the specific legal framing of the vacancy affidavit was incredibly reckless for a single transaction. It was written like a continuation of an established pattern, not a brand new lie. He looked at the paperwork, then looked back at me, his voice dead serious. He told me that if this was the first time my father had weaponized my existence to execute a financial fraud, he would be genuinely surprised. 48 hours after I dropped the fraudulent relocation waiver on his desk, Darius Bell called me back into his office. He had not been idle. Sitting beside him at the scarred wooden conference table was Naomi Price. Naomi was a forensic accountant who approached family wealth ledgers with the cold, detached precision of a medical examiner conducting an autopsy. The large table was completely buried under towering stacks of paper. I saw 7 years of the young family's financial footprint laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. There were property insurance claims, state tax filings, household expense ledgers, and seemingly every single piece of paper my father had ever shoved across a desk for my rushed signature. Naomi did not offer any polite greetings. She simply slid a thick blue folder across the wood toward me. Inside were 4 separate state and federal tax declarations. My signature sat neatly on the bottom line of each page, executing the documents under penalty of perjury. I stared hard at the blue ink. The aggressive loops of the letters were distinctly mine. The slight leftward slant was perfectly accurate. But the dates printed next to the signatures were entirely impossible. One document was dated the 2nd week of August. 3 years ago. I remembered that exact week perfectly because I was actively overseeing a massive, chaotic mold remediation for a flooded basement estate in Montauk, working grueling 20-hour shifts. I was absolutely not sitting in Grant's quiet study signing tax forms. Naomi handed me a magnifying glass and pointed to the slight, unnatural pixelation around the edges of the ink. My father had lifted my signature from an old, expired lease agreement and digitally grafted it onto his asset declarations. The depth of the lie was breathtaking in its clinical precision. Grant had not simply let me live in the drafty carriage house out of a warped, reluctant sense of patriarchal duty. In his federal filings, he had officially classified me as full-time, live-in domestic support. He systematically downgraded my actual, unspoken role in the family to a menial labor classification. By doing so, he legally transformed my mere existence into a massive, recurring operating expense for his estate. He claimed staggering tax deductions for my housing, my utilities, and my supposed board. I was not his struggling daughter trying to rebuild her life. I was a highly lucrative, entirely silent tax shield. Darius reached across the table and placed a heavy stack of contractor invoices next to the fraudulent tax forms. Every single bill in the pile was officially addressed to the carriage cottage. One invoice outlined $42,000 for structural reinforcement and premium weatherproofing. Another billed $18,000 for imported slate tile and custom copper fixtures. I lived in that cottage every single day. The winter wind still rattled the original. Single-pane windows. The floorboards were bare, splintering pine, and the roof leaked into a plastic bucket during heavy storms. Not a single cent of that money ever went to my roof. Naomi silently cross-referenced the invoice dates with the main estate's master ledger. The funds were seamlessly, illegally diverted to upgrade the massive wraparound terrace of the main house and to install a commercial-grade outdoor kitchen just in time for Grant's summer networking gala. He was siphoning tax-free improvement funds through my freezing, drafty living room to build his polished social empire. But the tax fraud and the forged signatures were merely the appetizer. The fatal, unforgivable blow came when Naomi opened a thin, red manila envelope. She did not speak as she handed me the banking statements. I looked at the bold header printed at the top of the page. It was the dedicated education trust fund established for Lila the week she was born. Grant was the named, legal custodian, bound by strict fiduciary duty to protect the principal until my daughter turned 18 years old. I scanned the transaction history, and my lungs completely stopped working. Over the past 4 years, massive chunks of capital had vanished from the account. There were dozens of aggressive withdrawals, each carefully labeled with vague, legally ambiguous descriptions like family care expenses, property management advances, and emergency household maintenance. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, completely gutted from my 9-year-old daughter's future. I looked up at Naomi. My chest felt like it was encased in solid iron. My voice was dangerously quiet when I asked her exactly where the money went. Naomi flipped to the wire transfer logs, her expression grim. The money did not go to household maintenance. It went directly into a secondary, discreet checking account registered under a different name. Sloan Young Mercer. My older sister had launched a highly publicized, deeply flawed charity initiative 2 years prior that had spectacularly collapsed, leaving her drowning in severe vendor debt and public embarrassment. Instead of letting his golden child face the consequences of her own incompetence, Grant quietly, methodically drained his granddaughter's education trust to plug the massive financial holes in Sloane's sinking ship. He also used the stolen funds to quietly pay down her staggering, maxed-out credit card balances, ensuring her pristine, wealthy image remained entirely untouched by reality. I sat back in the stiff leather chair. I did not scream. I did not cry. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the betrayal completely short-circuited any normal emotional response. Being called a maid at a dinner party was a petty, superficial insult designed to sting my pride. This was a complete, systemic annihilation of my humanity. To my father, Lila and I were not family. We were not even people. We were a series of exploitable numbers on a spreadsheet. We were disposable tools used to finance the glittering, fraudulent illusion of the young dynasty. The cold realization settled deep into my bones, instantly freezing away the last remaining, pathetic shreds of daughterly affection I had unknowingly been holding on to. Darius leaned forward, pulling the heavy documents back into a neat, secure pile. He spoke in a low, measured voice, laying out the battle plan. He explicitly warned me against a fiery, immediate confrontation. Walking into the main house right now and screaming about stolen funds would only give Grant the opportunity to destroy the paper trail, hire aggressive defense attorneys, and spin a devastating narrative of a hysterical, ungrateful daughter suffering from a breakdown. Darius outlined a methodical, devastating sequence of legal actions. We would immediately file sealed civil motions to freeze the remaining assets in the trust and legally remove Grant as the custodian, locking him out of the accounts. Simultaneously, Naomi would finalize a comprehensive forensic packet, preparing a direct criminal referral for federal tax fraud and embezzlement. Darius would hold that referral in reserve, keeping it locked in his vault as the ultimate, undeniable leverage. He told me I had to go back to the estate, smile, and play my assigned role for just a few more days while he meticulously locked the legal traps into place. He needed absolute silence until the trap was perfectly primed to spring. I looked at the forged signature on the tax form. I looked at the zero balance on my daughter's stolen future. I told Darius I completely agreed with his strategy. But I had one absolute, non-negotiable condition. Grant had spent weeks meticulously planning his grand Thanksgiving dinner. He had invited the most powerful people in his orbit to witness his triumph and my engineered humiliation. If my father desperately wanted the holiday to be a theatrical stage to present his version of the family, I would not deny him that stage. I would simply rewrite the entire script. I told Darius that when the truth finally came out, it was not going to happen in a quiet, confidential legal settlement behind closed doors. It was going to debut right there, in the main dining room, underneath the crystal chandelier, in front of every single investor he was desperately trying to impress. I knew that if I immediately picked up my phone and called Malcolm Reed to expose my father, I would lose the entire war. Grant was a master manipulator who had spent decades cultivating his image as a respectable titan of Connecticut real estate. If I charged in with emotional accusations about a fraudulent relocation waiver, Grant would effortlessly flip the narrative. He would play the exhausted, victimized patriarch. He would tell Malcolm that his troubled daughter was having a mental breakdown and trying to sabotage a complex, multi-million-dollar commercial transaction out of sheer spite. I needed Malcolm to discover the liability himself, through his own corporate mechanisms, so the fallout would be purely contractual and impossible for my father to spin. Instead of a frantic phone call, I opened my encrypted corporate email portal. I drafted a standard, highly technical advisory memo to Malcolm under my Northbridge Estate Continuity Group signature. I titled the subject line regarding fourth quarter compliance protocols for active acquisitions. In the body of the text, I did not mention Grant, the Young family estate, or the carriage cottage. I simply posed a rigorous operational question. I asked Malcolm how Reed and Vale Residential currently preferred Northbridge to handle the sudden discovery of heavily concealed residential encumbrances on properties newly classified as vacant commercial developments. It was a precise, calculated tripwire. The response arrived in my inbox exactly 14 minutes later. It was not routed through his executive assistant. It came directly from Malcolm. It contained 2 sentences. It told me to call his private, unlisted cell phone number at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. It also noted that his chief corporate counsel would be joining the line. At 8 o'clock sharp, I dialed the number. The line clicked open. Malcolm did not bother with polite evening greetings. His voice was heavy, sharp, and intensely focused. He introduced his general counsel and then immediately took the floor. Before I could even begin to explain the hypothetical scenario from my email, Malcolm completely shattered the board. He told me he already knew my maiden name. He knew exactly whose property I lived on, and he knew the exact psychological warfare my father waged. I sat frozen in my office chair. For 3 years, I had maintained an impenetrable firewall between my corporate identity and my toxic family. Malcolm listened to my silence and then delivered a revelation that completely realigned my understanding of my own company. He explained that 16 months ago, Northbridge had secured a critical round of expansion capital from a silent private equity syndicate. I had signed the paperwork, thinking it was an anonymous institutional investor. Malcolm calmly informed me that he was the primary backer of that syndicate. He had purchased a 15% equity stake in my firm through a blind trust. He made it completely clear that he did not invest out of charity. Nor did he invest because he cared about Grant Young's daughter. He invested his capital because my operational risk metrics were the highest he had ever seen in the tri-state area. He recognized a relentless, highly competent founder, and he wanted a piece of the profit. He had kept his identity hidden and his knowledge of my family strictly compartmentalized because he respected the professional boundary I had so aggressively built. But my email had signaled a breach in that boundary, and Malcolm never ignored a red flag regarding his investments. Taking a steady breath, I laid my cards on the table. I dropped the hypothetical framing. I explicitly detailed the 30-page relocation waiver Grant had tried to force me to sign. I explained the fraudulent vacancy affidavit attached to the back, and I named Harbor Horizon Holdings Limited as the purchasing entity. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I presented it strictly as a massive, toxic liability currently buried inside his acquisition pipeline. Malcolm did not express pity. He did not promise to ride in on a white horse and save me from my family. His reaction was pure, terrifying corporate pragmatism. He thanked me for the intelligence report. He stated that Reed and Vale possessed rigorous, unforgiving internal audit protocols for dealing with sellers who deliberately falsified representations and warranties on federal transfer documents. He said he would instruct his legal team to quietly pull the closing files the next morning and run a comprehensive verification on Grant's claims. He ended the call by advising me to protect my own assets and let his compliance division handle the rest, while Malcolm mobilized his corporate machinery. Darius Bell executed my legal strikes with surgical precision. On Wednesday morning, Less than 24 hours before the holiday dinner, Darius walked into the county courthouse. He filed an emergency, heavily sealed ex parte motion targeting the remnants of Lila's education trust fund, using the forensic accounting packet Naomi Price had assembled. He successfully secured a temporary restraining order that completely froze the accounts and legally barred Grant from acting as the custodian. Grant would not receive the automated notification from the bank until Friday morning, meaning he would sit at the head of the Thanksgiving table entirely unaware that he had already been stripped of his financial weapon. Simultaneously, Darius drafted a devastating formal notice of dispute regarding my tenancy in the carriage cottage. It outlined the forged tax documents and the misappropriated construction funds, but Darius did not mail it. He kept the certified envelope locked inside his briefcase. We agreed that the timing of the delivery was everything. He would hold the strike until I gave him the absolute. Final signal, with the legal and financial traps perfectly primed. My only remaining task was to play my assigned role flawlessly. On Thursday afternoon, I walked across the frozen lawn to the main house. I wore a simple, unassuming wool sweater. Exactly the kind of plain clothing my family expected from their resident failure. I walked into the sprawling, chaotic kitchen and found my mother directing the catering staff. I kept my eyes lowered, my voice soft and compliant. I asked Elaine where she wanted me to arrange the extra seating. I spent 2 hours folding heavy linen napkins and polishing silverware for the secondary tables. Grant walked through the dining room several times, checking the floral arrangements. Every time he looked at me, I saw a flicker of absolute, smug satisfaction in his eyes. He saw a defeated woman quietly completing her chores. He genuinely believed that the sheer weight of the holiday pressure and my mother's emotional manipulation had broken my resolve. He thought I would quietly sign the waiver on Friday morning and disappear. I let him believe it. I let him marinate in his false victory. My final, most important strategic move was securing the absolute safety of my child. The dining room was going to become a war zone, and I refused to let my daughter become collateral damage. I found Aunt Ruth in the back hallway, carrying a tray of crystal glasses. I pulled her into the quiet pantry and shut the heavy wooden door. I looked my aunt directly in the eyes and told her that under no circumstances was Lila to set foot in the formal dining room during the main dinner service. Ruth was a sharp, observant woman. She took one look at my face and did not ask a single question. I told her to set up a private dinner for the two of them in the back sunroom, complete with her favorite movies and an early slice of pumpkin pie. I needed Lila completely insulated, surrounded by warmth and distraction, so she would not have to witness the sheer, terrifying brutality of the adults when the pristine illusion of the young family finally burned to the ground. The atmosphere inside the main house grew increasingly toxic and suffocating as the final hours before the holiday dinner ticked away. Sloane paraded through the sprawling living spaces with her usual cultivated arrogance, loudly criticizing the expensive floral arrangements and questioning the caterer about the origin of the butter. But to my trained eyes, her pristine armor was visibly fracturing. I watched her from the periphery while I arranged the heavy silver flatware. Her eyes were constantly darting to the glowing screen of her phone, her thumb swiping aggressively. She jumped at sudden, insignificant noises. More tellingly, she actively avoided making any eye contact with our father. On Wednesday afternoon, when Grant casually mentioned finalizing the quarterly ledger reviews with his private accountant, Sloane's face drained of all color. Her manicured hand gripped the edge of the marble kitchen island so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She was absolutely terrified. That night, well past midnight, I heard the distinct crunch of expensive leather boots on the frosted gravel outside my door. I opened the heavy wooden door of the carriage cottage to find my older sister standing in the freezing, biting wind. She wore a thick cashmere coat pulled tight around her shoulders. She did not knock, and she certainly did not offer a polite greeting or an apology for invading my private space. She simply pushed past me into the drafty front room, aggressively rubbing her arms against the chill that seeped through the walls. She paced the small, dimly lit room, absolutely refusing to look at me directly. She spoke in hushed, frantic, urgent tones. She issued a direct warning, telling me not to cause a scene or ask stupid questions at the dinner table the following evening. She claimed Grant was on the verge of closing a commercial deal that was vital to the survival of the entire family ecosystem, and any emotional outbursts or stubbornness from me regarding the relocation papers would ruin everything for everyone. I stood by the front door, letting the freezing winter air bite into my skin. I did not offer her a chair or a warm drink. I simply looked at her shaking hands and asked her the only question that actually mattered. I kept my voice dead level and asked her point blank if my 9-year-old daughter's stolen education fund was currently paying off her massive, hidden debts. Sloane stopped pacing abruptly. She turned her head sharply, her perfectly sculpted face twisting into a complex mask of defensiveness, panic, and deep shame. She did not deny the accusation. She did not offer a tearful apology or try to invent a lie. She simply crossed her arms tightly across her chest and told me, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hysteria, that I had absolutely no idea how complex and dangerous things were right now. She hissed that keeping up the family name required ugly sacrifices that my small, practical mind could not possibly comprehend. Looking at her standing in my freezing bare living room, the bitter, heavy resentment I had carried for 7 long years suddenly shifted into a state of cold, clinical clarity. Sloane was not the powerful, independent matriarch in waiting that the town believed her to be. She was a beautifully dressed, heavily indebted hostage. She absolutely reaped the financial benefits of Grant's ongoing fraud, but she was also trapped in a terrifying, gilded cage, completely reliant on his illegal maneuvering to maintain her fake, luxurious reality. She was his golden pawn, forced to blindly dance to his tune to avoid total public ruin. The next morning, Aunt Ruth found me standing alone in the back pantry. She did not say a single word about the thick tension radiating through every room of the house. She simply walked up to me and handed me a heavy, dust-covered cardboard box. It was an old, battered file storage bin that had belonged to my late grandmother. Ruth told me she had been clearing out the attic spaces and thought I should look through the folders buried at the very bottom. I took the heavy box back to the cottage and opened it on my small, scratched kitchen table, beneath layers of old holiday greeting cards and faded family photographs. I found a thick manila folder filled with carbon copy receipts and handwritten ledger pages. They were my own personal records from my first 3 desperate years back on the estate. Documents I honestly thought I had lost during a massive basement flood years ago. I spread the fragile papers across the table. There were faded, crumpled receipts from the local hardware store for industrial space heaters, specialized roofing tar, and heavy-duty plumbing fixtures. I had paid for every single item out of my own meager earnings from scrubbing floors across the county. I even found the canceled carbon check I wrote to a local, independent contractor to reinforce the collapsing foundation of the cottage. These were the exact same structural repairs and systemic upgrades Grant had brazenly claimed as massive. Owner paid operational expenses on his federal tax returns to secure his fraudulent deductions. By themselves, these faded pieces of paper were not enough to single-handedly win a massive federal financial fraud case, but they were the vital, missing puzzle pieces Darius needed. They provided absolute, physical proof of a coordinated, multi-year chain of perjury regarding both the financial upkeep of the property and my legal residency status. I took out my phone, photographed every single document with meticulous care, and uploaded them directly to the highly secure server Darius maintained at his firm. By Thursday afternoon, the main house was a chaotic whirlwind of hired caterers, florists, and event staff. My mother, Elaine, drifted gracefully through the chaos, flawlessly playing the role of the benevolent, deeply concerned peacemaker. She offered me gentle, condescending smiles, praised my precise folding of the dinner napkins, and continually reminded everyone within earshot that the holidays were strictly about family unity and forgiveness. It was a suffocating, masterfully executed performance. At exactly 3 o'clock, My phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out, fully expecting a strategic update from Darius. Instead, it was an incoming text message from my mother. I stared down at the bright screen, the black text burning itself permanently into my memory. The message read exactly like this: "Make sure you keep Brooklyn completely quiet and compliant tonight. Do whatever it takes to keep her calm. Once the commercial loan is officially signed on Tuesday morning, we can finally force her out of that cottage legally and be done with her." Elaine had clearly meant to send the urgent message to Sloane. In her frantic, high society haste to manage the moving pieces of the dinner party, she had carelessly selected the wrong daughter in her contacts. That single, accidentally misplaced text message was the final. Brutal psychological knife sliding effortlessly between my ribs. It instantly severed the last pathetic, microscopic thread of hope I had foolishly kept buried deep in my chest. For years, I had desperately tried to convince myself that Grant's cruelty was an isolated character flaw, and that perhaps my mother was just a passive, frightened bystander caught in his wake. But those sentences proved the devastating, undeniable truth. This was absolutely not a momentary lapse in parental judgment or a sudden, unpredictable burst of anger from my father. This was a highly coordinated, fully premeditated family conspiracy. My mother was not a bystander. She was an active, willing architect of my destruction. I locked my phone screen and slipped the device back into my pocket. I did not storm into the kitchen to confront my mother. I did not scream, and I did not throw the polished silver across the room. The hot, blinding anger that had been threatening to consume my mind for days suddenly and completely evaporated, leaving behind a vast, icy expanse of total, ruthless calculation. I made my absolute, final decision standing right there in the quiet hallway. When the guests arrived and the dinner commenced, I would not give my family the twisted satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I would not raise my voice. I would not argue back. And I absolutely would not play the assigned part of the hysterical, jealous sister ruining a beautiful evening. I would become a perfect silent mirror. I would let them build their beautiful, fraudulent stage. I would let Grant pour the expensive vintage wine and boast about his phantom commercial success to the billionaires. And then, when the moment was perfectly aligned and the tension was absolute, I would let the truth speak for me. I would step back and let the heavily redacted legal contracts, the forged tax clauses, and the verified, undeniable facts tear their entire empire down to the bare studs. By 5 o'clock on the fourth Thursday of November, the main floor of the young estate had been completely transformed into a suffocating, glossy editorial spread. Grant had spared absolutely zero expense. He needed the optics of this evening to be entirely impenetrable. He was desperately masking a year of catastrophic financial instability with towering centerpieces of imported white orchids and heavy silver candelabras. Hundreds of tall beeswax candles cast a thick, flickering glow over the pristine crystal wine glasses and the perfectly starched white linen tablecloth. At every single place setting, a heavy cream-colored cardstock menu was beautifully embossed with the guest's name in shining gold foil. The entire room smelled heavily of roasting sage, burning wax, and desperate, aggressive wealth. It was a perfectly staged theater of power, and every single detail in the room was a carefully concealed wire waiting to be tripped. I walked into the grand, sweeping foyer wearing a simple, flawlessly tailored dark wool dress with a high collar and long sleeves. I wore absolutely zero jewelry, carried no designer handbag, and my dark hair was pulled back tightly into a severe, highly practical knot. It was a deliberate, quiet elegance that completely bypassed the flashy, competitive couture worn by the other wealthy women in our social circle. When several early arrivals stepped through the front door and automatically handed me their heavy winter coats, assuming I was merely a senior member of the hired catering staff, I did not bother to correct them. I simply smiled politely, took the heavy cashmere and wool garments, and hung them quietly in the front hall closet. My silent compliance seamlessly reinforced the exact, degrading narrative my father was preparing to sell to the room. I walked into the dining room and examined the elaborate seating chart. Grant had placed himself at the absolute head of the massive, long mahogany table, directly to his right, in the ultimate position of power and honor, was the seat reserved for Malcolm Reed. My own gold-embossed name card was positioned at the very opposite end of the long table, seated dangerously close to the swinging kitchen doors. I was placed exactly on the physical borderline between the esteemed, powerful guests and the invisible service staff. I was a favored servant, graciously allowed to occupy a chair at the very edge of the kingdom. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, the heavy brass knocker sounded against the front door. Malcolm Reed stepped into the warm foyer. He did not arrive alone. Beside him stood his formidable wife, Tessa Reed. Tessa was a razor-sharp, highly respected corporate attorney who served as the senior in-house counsel for the massive Reed and Vale empire. She wore a striking, impeccably structured emerald blazer and surveyed the opulent entryway with the cool, detached precision of a seasoned predator evaluating its prey. Both Malcolm and Tessa were perfectly, flawlessly polite as Grant rushed forward to take their coats, aggressively performing his role as the gracious, incredibly wealthy patriarch. But while Grant loudly boasted about the rare vintage wine he had decanted for the evening, I watched Tessa's dark, intelligent eyes track his every single movement. She was not charmed by the performance. She was meticulously cataloging the frantic, underlying desperation hidden inside my father's booming laughter. She watched closely how Grant casually dismissed the busy catering manager with an arrogant flick of his wrist. Tessa was quietly observing the deep structural cracks in the family foundation before the earthquake even hit, while the powerful guests mingled in the front parlor, sipping from their expensive champagne flutes. My mother suddenly summoned me into the massive, chaotic commercial kitchen. Several of the wealthy, highly influential wives had followed Elaine into the space to admire the custom marble countertops. Elaine saw her captive audience and instantly seized the perfect opportunity to establish the baseline for my impending public humiliation. With a sweet, entirely venomous smile plastered across her face, she handed me a damp linen rag. She pointed directly to a minor water spill near the massive industrial sink and loudly asked me to quickly wipe it up before the real staff slipped, adding that I had always been so naturally good at keeping things tidy around the property. She used a high, patronizing tone usually reserved for speaking to a slow, heavily obedient child. The other well-dressed women in the room abruptly stopped talking, exchanging deeply uncomfortable, pitying glances. I did not hesitate. I took the damp cloth from her manicured hand. I wiped the polished marble counter until it was completely dry and spotless. I stood up straight, looked my mother directly in the eyes, smiled pleasantly, and asked if there was absolutely any other mess she needed me to clean up before dinner. Elaine visibly flinched, deeply unnerved by the total absence of shame, embarrassment, or anger in my calm response. She did not know that a woman currently holding the launch codes does not care about holding a damp rag. 10 minutes before the dinner chime was scheduled to echo through the massive house, I made my way down the hall to the back family room. Aunt Ruth was sitting cross-legged on the thick carpet, setting up a complex, colorful board game. Next to her on a small table was a massive slice of warm pecan pie on a delicate china plate. Lila was sitting beside her, laughing loudly as she rolled the dice across the floor. Ruth looked up at me, the humorous warmth vanishing from her face, leaving her expression completely solemn. She gave me a single, firm, decisive nod. The door to the back room was made of thick, heavy solid oak, once that door was completely shut. Absolutely no sound from the formal dining room would reach my 9-year-old daughter's ears. She was perfectly, safely insulated in a protective bubble of sugar and distraction. She would not have to hear her own grandfather call her mother a maid, and she would absolutely not have to witness the devastating, clinical execution that would immediately follow his toast. I walked back out into the main hallway just as the guests were being politely corralled toward the dining room. I stepped into the heavy shadows near the base of the grand staircase and pulled my cellular phone from my pocket. The bright screen illuminated with a single, highly encrypted text message from Darius Bell. The text was brief, cold, and entirely definitive. He confirmed that the emergency legal injunction designed to completely freeze and protect the Educational Trust Fund had been successfully signed and processed by the county judge exactly 1 hour ago. Furthermore, he stated that the formal legal notice regarding the fraudulent residency dispute was queued in his system and ready for immediate electronic dispatch the second I gave him the green light. The massive financial lock was officially turned. Just 20 feet away, standing near the towering antique grandfather clock, Malcolm Reed separated himself from the moving crowd. He held his own mobile phone pressed tightly to his ear. I watched from the shadows as the hard, professional mask of his face suddenly tightened into a look of absolute, unforgiving corporate rage. He spoke only 2 short words into the receiver, thanked his legal division, and abruptly ended the call. His aggressive compliance team had completed the internal audit. They had officially, legally confirmed the massive, material misrepresentation in Grant's property declarations. The fraudulent paperwork regarding my cottage was no longer a lingering suspicion. It was a verified, documented, catastrophic breach of contract by the seller. Malcolm slipped his phone back into his tailored suit jacket, caught my eye across the crowded hallway, and gave the absolute slightest, almost imperceptible downward tilt of his head. The psychological chessboard was completely locked. Every single piece was perfectly positioned on its designated square. The trap was armed. The legal escape routes were completely severed, and the wealthy audience was blindly taking their seats, as Grant loudly directed everyone to their specific chairs. His chest puffed out with sheer, arrogant pride. He genuinely, deeply believed he was the absolute master of the evening. He believed he was flawlessly conducting a grand symphony of power, wealth, and influence. He had absolutely no idea that he was merely the warm-up act for his own professional funeral. I walked slowly toward the back of the long table, took my assigned seat by the swinging kitchen doors, and waited in perfect, freezing silence for my father to finally hand me the match. The heavy double doors of the main parlor opened, and the crowd of wealthy guests began their slow, polite migration toward the dining room. I stood near the edge of the hallway, waiting for the corridor to clear so I could take my assigned seat at the far end of the table. Just as I stepped forward, a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. The grip was tight, desperate, and trembling. I turned and found my older sister standing flush against the flocked wallpaper, completely hidden from the main flow of traffic. Sloane was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving beneath her designer silk gown. Her flawless makeup could not hide the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from her eyes. Before I could ask her to release my arm, she shoved a small, cold object directly into my palm. My fingers closed around a sleek metal thumb drive. Sloane leaned in, her voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. She told me I absolutely did not hear this from her, and that she was never in this hallway. I looked down at the metal drive, then back up at her terrified face. I am a woman who dissects human behavior for a living, and it took me exactly 2 seconds to map out the psychological reality of this moment. My sister was not experiencing a sudden, miraculous crisis of conscience. She was not seeking redemption for standing by while our father financially gutted my life. Sloane was handing over the enemy playbooks because she had finally realized she was entirely expendable. She had done the math. She knew that if Malcolm Reed's legal team discovered the massive discrepancies in the property filings and blew up the commercial transaction, Grant would need a scapegoat to present to his furious investors and to the federal tax authorities. Grant was meticulously planning to pivot the entire narrative, pinning the missing capital and the fraudulent restructuring directly onto Sloane's failed charitable foundation and her massive, undocumented personal debts. She was not saving me. She was desperately trying to save herself by throwing the architect of the fraud directly into the fire. I did not offer her a word of forgiveness, nor did I thank her. I simply slipped the drive into the hidden pocket of my wool dress and walked away, leaving her trembling in the shadows. I bypassed the dining room entirely and slipped into the small, marble-lined powder room tucked beneath the main staircase. I locked the heavy brass latch, pulled my cellular phone from my pocket, and attached a small data adapter to the metal drive. The screen illuminated, revealing a highly organized folder containing just 2 files. The first was a scanned, multi-page document holding a long chain of emails between my father and his senior private accountant, a slippery man named Howard Pike. I zoomed in on the harsh black text, reading the exchanges sent over the past 12 months. Howard had explicitly warned my father in writing about the severe legal exposure of their ongoing tax strategy. The accountant wrote that they needed a much stronger, more permanent paper trail to justify the massive, ongoing deductions taken against the Carriage estate. Grant's reply, sent on a Tuesday afternoon 4 months ago, was a masterpiece of cold, premeditated arrogance. My father had typed out clear, undeniable instructions to legally frame me as live-in domestic support. He explicitly ordered Howard to draft whatever internal documents were necessary to permanently classify my existence as a dedicated household operating expense, noting that doing so would perfectly legitimize the financial ledgers required to secure the massive new capital loan. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of a coordinated financial conspiracy. I closed the document and tapped on the second file. It was a compressed audio recording. I pressed the speaker to my ear. The background hummed with the ambient noise of a busy airport lounge, followed by my father's unmistakable, booming voice. He was on a phone call with Sloane. Her voice was muffled and panicked on the other end, crying about her spiraling vendor debts and the threat of public bankruptcy. Grant's response was chilling in its absolute lack of hesitation. He told his favorite daughter to stop crying and let him handle it. He promised her that her massive debts would be entirely reimbursed from that other fund the very second the commercial real estate deal officially closed. That other fund. He was casually promising the remaining balance of my 9-year-old daughter's protected educational trust to wipe away the reckless, superficial mistakes of his golden child. The audio file was the final, devastating puzzle piece. It provided the indisputable motive. The smoking gun that proved Grant was not just cutting corners, but actively cannibalizing one daughter's future to maintain the fake, glittering illusion of the other. I quickly forwarded the encrypted files directly to Darius Bell. I stood in the quiet, brightly lit bathroom and waited. Exactly 1 minute later, a text message from Darius appeared on my screen. He confirmed that the documents possessed massive, undeniable investigative value. He wrote that while formal criminal procedures would take weeks to process through the federal courts, these specific files gave us the absolute, immediate leverage to dictate terms tonight. We held the execution order. I disconnected the drive, dropped it deep into my pocket, and unlocked the bathroom door. I walked down the long corridor and stepped into the dining room. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted meat, expensive wine, and burning beeswax candles. The wealthy guests were taking their seats, their voices a low, polite murmur of social pleasantries. I moved silently toward my assigned chair near the kitchen doors. As I pulled my seat back, I felt a heavy, piercing gaze lock onto me from the far end of the room. I looked up. Malcolm Reed was sitting perfectly still in the seat of honor next to the head of the table. He was ignoring the lively conversation of the woman seated to his left. He was watching me. Malcolm saw the subtle, undeniable shift in my posture. He saw the cold, dead calm in my eyes. He was a man who had built an empire by reading the exact moment a hostile takeover became inevitable. We did not exchange a single word, but the silent communication was absolute. He knew the ordnance was fully loaded. He knew the safety was off. Malcolm slowly reached for his crystal water glass, took a measured sip, and leaned back in his heavy chair. He opted for total quiet, playing the role of an ideal, enraptured listener, biding his time as my dad confidently rose to his feet to orchestrate his own public humiliation before the assembled crowd. I took my seat. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of the holiday feast into my lungs. I took my cellular phone, placed it face down right next to my silver fork, and rested my hands quietly in my lap. I was no longer the wounded daughter desperately waiting for a scrap of respect or validation from the head of the table. I was the architect of his absolute ruin, waiting for the precise, perfect second to block every single one of his escape routes. The first two courses of the dinner proceeded with a terrifying, flawless smoothness. The hired staff moved like ghosts, pouring vintage wine and clearing expensive china. The conversation flowed effortlessly around the table, touching on stock portfolios, winter vacations in the Swiss Alps, and local political gossip. Grant was entirely in his element. He laughed loudly, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, holding court as the undisputed king of his domain. He believed the evening was a total, unmitigated triumph. He believed the loan was secure. His secrets were buried, and his absolute control over the family was fully intact. It was exactly this sickening, perfect smoothness that made the impending collision so beautiful. The absolute absence of conflict lulled Grant into a state of supreme, toxic overconfidence. As the empty dinner plates were finally cleared away and the heavy crystal decanters of after-dinner port were brought out, the room settled into a warm, satisfied lull. I watched my father reach out and wrap his fingers around the stem of his champagne flute. I watched him push his chair back and slowly rise to his feet. The final act was about to begin, and he was completely blind to the abyss waiting just one step ahead. Grant tapped his silver spoon against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear chime cut through the warm hum of the dining room. 16 wealthy guests immediately ceased their conversations and turned their attention to the head of the table. Grant stood tall, his chest puffed out with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He raised his glass, the golden liquid catching the light of 100 flickering beeswax candles. He began his rehearsed speech, perfectly executing the classic, toxic family script. He spoke about the value of legacy and the hard, unforgiving nature of the real estate market over the past 12 months. Then, he turned his proud gaze toward his right side. He praised Sloane, calling her the absolute pride of the young family, the flawless, glittering face of our local philanthropy. The guests smiled warmly, raising their glasses in a polite, synchronized salute to my sister. Then, Grant let the warm smile drop from his face. His eyes slid down the long expanse of mahogany and locked onto me, seated near the swinging kitchen doors. A sharp, cruel smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. He adjusted his tailored jacket and delivered the punchline he had been planning for weeks. "And down at the end, we have Brooklyn," Grant announced, his voice booming with theatrical, mocking affection. "Sloane is the beauty, but Brooklyn is the one who keeps the estate spotless. She is the maid of our family." A smattering of polite, incredibly awkward laughter fluttered around the table. Some guests looked down at their plates. Others offered tight, nervous smiles, unsure how to process the blatant humiliation. They waited for me to shrink into my chair, to flush with deep shame, or to quietly excuse myself from the room. I did none of those things. I placed my heavy linen napkin perfectly flat on the table. I did not scream. I did not cry, and my hands did not shake. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping of the wooden legs against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the suddenly dead, suffocatingly quiet room. I have indeed spent years scrubbing floors and cleaning up massive disasters in other people's homes, I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the length of the table. And I have absolutely zero shame in that honest labor. But since my father is so passionate about presenting the absolute truth to his most valued investors tonight, I think we should clarify my actual professional title. Grant's cruel smile faltered. His brow furrowed in sudden, deep confusion. I did not look at him. I looked directly at the wealthy, silent audience. "My name is Brooklyn Young," I stated, the words striking the air like a gavel. I am the founder and managing principal of Northbridge Estate Continuity Group. We provide comprehensive operational risk management and emergency continuity for ultra-high net worth estates. My firm currently manages over 40 exclusive properties across the eastern seaboard. We employ a dedicated team of 50 specialized personnel and generate multiple millions of dollars in annual revenue. And for the past 2 years, we have served as the primary operational vendor for the most lucrative private assets managed by Reed and Vale Residential. The absolute, paralyzing silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the foundation of the house. Grant opened his mouth, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, fully prepared to shout me down and call me a delusional liar. He never got the chance. At the right side of the table, Malcolm Reed set his crystal water glass down. He pushed his chair back and stood up, towering over my father. Malcolm did not look at Grant. He looked directly at me. "I can absolutely confirm every single word," Malcolm said, his deep, resonant voice leaving absolutely zero room for debate. "Brooklyn is the most capable, ruthless operating partner my firm has ever contracted. I have known her actual title and the true scale of her business for over 16 months. Grant looked at Malcolm, his jaw physically dropping. The carefully constructed illusion of the all-powerful patriarch shattered into a million pieces right in front of his eyes. But Malcolm was not finished. He turned slowly and locked his cold, predatory gaze onto my father. This was the absolute kill shot. "Furthermore," Malcolm continued, his tone shifting from professional respect to corporate execution, "my legal compliance division finalized a rapid audit exactly 45 minutes ago. They formally confirmed that the seller of the Harbor Horizon Development Tract has submitted material misrepresentations regarding the legal residency and vacancy status of the included carriage property. Because of this verified document fraud, our acquisition agreement is entirely frozen, effective immediately, pending a massive breach of contract review." Grant stumbled backward, the back of his knees hitting his chair. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table as if the floor had just vanished beneath him. He was losing the deal. He was losing the leverage. He was losing everything. I did not let him catch his breath. I stepped away from my chair, my voice slicing through the thick tension. "And the fraud does not stop at commercial zoning," I announced, delivering the final, devastating legal blow. At 2:00 this afternoon, my corporate attorney officially filed a sealed injunction with the county court. The education trust fund belonging to my 9-year-old daughter is now legally frozen. Grant has been formally stripped of his custodial access. He will now be forced to answer to a federal judge regarding the hundreds of thousands of dollars he illegally withdrew using forged signatures and entirely fabricated tax declarations, falsely claiming me as a live-in domestic expense to shield his own failing assets. At the opposite end of the table, Tessa Reed, Malcolm's formidable wife and chief legal counsel, leaned forward. Her dark eyes were entirely devoid of pity. She delivered her line with the cold, effortless precision of a seasoned assassin. "We do not do business with absolutely anyone who uses their own household family members as camouflage for federal document fraud," Tessa stated clearly. The entire dinner table sat frozen and stunned, breathless horror. Grant's face twisted into a mask of pure, trapped desperation. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the fine china. He pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming that I was a bitter, destructive liar trying to tear my own family apart just to steal the spotlight. He demanded that someone escort me out of his house, but the pressure in the room had reached a critical, fatal mass, and the weakest link finally snapped. A sharp, hysterical sob ripped through the silence. Sloane buried her face in her hands, her shoulders violently shaking. The pristine, untouchable golden child completely collapsed under the weight of the exposure. "Stop it!" Sloane cried out, her voice broken and desperate. She looked up, her mascara running down her perfectly powdered cheeks, directly confirming the worst of the accusations in front of 16 powerful witnesses. "Just stop lying. He used my name. He drained Lila's account to cover my charity debts because I was going totally bankrupt. The money is gone. It is all gone. She had unknowingly provided the absolute. Public confession of the underlying motive. Grant stared at his favorite daughter, completely horrified, realizing she had just hammered the final nail into his coffin. No one yelled. No one threw their drinks. The destruction of the Young dynasty happened in a terrifying, civilized silence. The investors, the attorneys, and the wealthy neighbors slowly stood up from the table. They did not say goodbye. They did not thank their host for the meal. They simply retrieved their coats from the front hall and walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving their expensive wine untouched and the holiday feast completely abandoned. Grant's reputation, his credit, and his entire social standing evaporated into the cold November night. 18 months later, the fallout was absolute. The massive federal investigations and the collapsed commercial loans forced the entire estate into immediate foreclosure. Grant and Elaine quietly relocated to a small, rented condominium 2 states away, entirely exiled from the high society they worshipped. Sloan was forced to declare public bankruptcy and finally get a real, entry-level job. I purchased the Darien estate directly from the holding bank. I did not buy it under my own name. I bought it through the corporate entity of Northbridge. I ordered contractors to tear down the drafty carriage cottage entirely. We gutted the massive, opulent main house and completely transformed it. It is no longer a monument to toxic wealth. It now serves as the official regional training center for Northbridge Estate Continuity Group. We specifically recruit and train single mothers, teaching them elite operational management, risk assessment, and legal compliance, giving them the exact tools they need to build their own impenetrable independence. On the day the facility officially opened, I stood on the massive wrap-around terrace with Lila. She was taller now, bright and fiercely observant. We looked out over the sprawling green lawns that I used to meticulously maintain for a father who never saw me. Lila looked up at me and asked if it felt strange to own the massive table where everything happened. I smiled, pulling her close against the crisp autumn wind. I did not need to find the right seat at their table anymore. I told her quietly. I built my own. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.